Professor Niv Horesh, welcome to BRI Dialogues. It's 15th of October 2021, but there's very few people in the world have gone back into the history and know the history of China and perhaps the history of fiscal and monetary history of China. Can you take us back a bit in time and share with us a little bit about what currency means in Chinese history so that we can arrive where we are in the world of bitcoins and digital currencies? But for many, maybe China is a new rising power, but share with us a little bit about what China knows about money way before many of other nations.
Thanks very much, Ali. I'm delighted to be with you on this session. Yes, China has got a very long history. And when we look back, money really meant different things at different times to different people. And so whilst, I guess the watershed is that whilst in the West, and by that I include West Asia, not just Europe, money connoted, or more than anything else, gold and silver. In China, more often than not, it actually connoted copper coins. So there are many divergences that historians like to talk about. Amongst those divergences, there's also what I call a money divergence. The conception of money was evolved quite differently in China. Having said that, we know China made a huge contribution to world monetary history, and that is the fact that it was the place where banknotes were first introduced and used, and for many decades used quite stably. In other words, without inflation, which is something that is hard to get at, and I think we're still struggling with it even in the modern world. So there's a legacy there to look and draw lessons from. Reaching modern times, I think what matters more than anything else when it comes to the history of money. I mean, we can talk a lot about the technicalities of money issuance in times past, and there's also a big story about how silver suddenly became the key currency in China. That is silver mainly from what is today Bolivia and Peru, mined there and brought to China either by Westerners or by intermediaries. That's a big story to tell as well. But moving on to modern times, where I think this session, where you guys might be more interested in, I think really inflation, the memory of inflation, is very touchy in China, in Chinese consciousness. And then this is why you see China going the extra mile to avoid inflation on its home soil. This is part of the party's mission, if you like, to ensure the stability of prices. Why is that? That is because in the Republican era and in the late imperial era, so about a century before the communists took over, there was great instability. There was overissuance of paper notes. There was also a minting of cheap copper coins, all of which caused great upheaval in the marketplace. These are very bitter memories. And if you look at films, for example, films from the 1950s, which try to sort of accentuate and entrench the meaning, the meaning or the value of the communist triumph, a lot of it is about getting rid of inflation. Now, China played a very significant role in stabilizing Asian economies during the Asian financial crisis. It didn't go into a currency war. It didn't sort of devalue its currency to get ahead of others. This is one thing that people still appreciate. I mean, there's a lot of things we can talk about which to China's detriment. But this is one thing I think China has acknowledged to have played, responsibly. And if you ask me, we're biased as historians, but if you ask me, I think that's got a little bit to do with this historical legacy of fighting inflation, that, it's in our veins, that, it's very, very important. So I hope that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. And I'm just going to have a follow-up into that. It was very interesting for me when you talked about imports of silver from Bolivia. How long ago was that development from a historical point of view? And because for many, China is going through Belt Road Initiative, and so that's one side of reflecting of some of these ties on precious metals. The other one is that in the school of trauma, they say human beings have DNAs, and the DNAs and the genes absorb and capture the trauma. Is this the same in fiscal policy as well? So that inflationary trauma has remained in the psyche of China today, and we should expect that to be protected and avoided at any price?
Start with the DNA question because it's kind of evocative. The problem with China is inflation is one thing that perhaps is said to be ingrained in people's consciousness, but China also says, peaceful development, Irenicism, even if an anti-war ethos, if you like, even pacifism to some extent. All of these are part of our DNA. That's what they say. And so when people come out and claim to have so many things in their DNA that biologists may question, we have a problem. I wouldn't be mentioning it if DNA wasn't actually used. They used the term DNA, and even Xi Jinping said at one point that invasion and occupation is not in our DNA. He didn't mention inflation, but I kind of diverted because it's kind of difficult to talk about it. I'd like to talk about consciousness, historical consciousness. I think yes, Irenicism is part of the Chinese historical consciousness. I would say yes. I would take the risk and sort of say yes. But DNA, that's a bit of a stretch, so to speak. As far as silver is concerned, it's a convoluted story where you remember Christopher Columbus. The reason why he actually sailed to what he thought was India, people think is spice, but it's not spice. If you look at the writing, if you look at the records we have from the time, it was actually gold, and gold in the first instance that he went after. And he did find a little bit of gold, but not much. What the Spaniards did strike up on, this is around about 16th century, is silver, and a lot of it by any stretch of the imagination. So there was a point around about the 17th century, I think, where almost half of the world output of silver was from South America. And where I think this sort of matters is if you look at Chinese writing, Chinese records from the time, it's kind of sad. They have really no clue, almost no clue where all of this silver suddenly comes from. But what they do sort of buy into is the narrative that silver is now really the touchstone of monetary stability, and they make, even though they have zero impact or zero influence over how this silver is mined, they make it the national currency, if you like.
Wow.
They don't coin it for various reasons, but ingots of silver become standardized. Ingots of silver become China's something amounting to national currency, if you like, or at least a higher denomination currency, government accounting. So that a lot of the taxation is now denominated in silver, And so in the debate over the great divergence, I think that is an important factor where, where you have one polity and one economy relying so heavily on a currency that it has zero impact on, a little bit relevant to modern times, if you like. Then we have here a divergence starting to be created because the fluctuations of output or availability of are really beyond China's reach. So that's part of the story.
Apologies for the noise outside. I just wanted to carry on with this same line of inquiry with you regarding the, if you like, the legacy of the recent past, and ask, so there is all this speculation about China wanting to replace the US dollar as the international currency. From what you've alluded to, they would probably run a mile from that kind of situation where their currency would then be under stress internationally, is one thing. The other, though, is given that they had no control over where the silver came from, as you said, they had no clue where this was coming from, right? And now if they feel that there is a vulnerability to the US dollar, is that one of the reasons why there is an interest in barter trade as opposed to currency trade? Does that make sense in any way? Or is that just a very kind of small way of enabling smaller economies to interact with China?
I think, Anush, you're very much on the money, so to speak, because the liberalizing the use of RMB internationalization as such is firstly technically very complex, and secondly also very, very risky. There were great strides made toward liberalization about 15 years back with great promise and great optimism. And Zhou Xiaochuan, who was the governor of the People's Bank of China and one of the luminaries there in terms of economic policy, pushed it very hard, and also it was able to convince a lot of the power brokers, a lot of the stalwarts, that this was worth trying. The reason for that is because the alternative, holding treasuries, is not that effective. I mean, the interest that China gains from holding US treasuries is low. But what happened subsequently, I think people sort of forgotten about this, is in 2015 we had the Shanghai stock exchange crash, and that was a big psychological blow to Zhou Xiaochuan and all of the old guard who were pushing for RMB liberalization, because there was great downward pressure on the RMB, and the estimates are about $1 trillion dollar worth of foreign reserve really escaped China as a result.
$1 trillion?
Yes.
$1 trillion, right.
So that's a big, the foreign reserve, the foreign currency reserve dropped so precipitously, Anush, that the alarm bells were crying out loud in Beijing, and there was and really Beijing cracked down on RMB liberalization since. So to go back to the historical story, yes, I mean, there's anything to do with monetary instability is really, is a bugbear. It's something that Beijing would like to avoid very, very much. And part of this are the memories from the late 40s. This is my view of it. This is part of it. But if we go back to the historical story further back in time, before the Spaniards, before the Americans were discovered, there was a time, in fact, where Chinese copper coins were really the official coinage or the international coinage of Southeast Asia. So there's another story here that we have to take into consideration, where Chinese currency is predominating in close by world markets. There's a story relating to the modern times. There's a story relating to the Tang and Song era. And all of this is part of a very, very complex and fascinating consciousness.
So to draw then on your historical parallels, Niv. So, let's take a strategic commodity like oil, for example, or natural gas, for example, which has traditionally been traded in dollars or denominated in US dollars. And that has all sorts of implications for both producers and consumers of oil. Given that we're still dependent on hydrocarbons for the next decades or so, some of the producers in particular would like to free themselves of dependence on the US dollar. So what would be Beijing's view on changing that transactional relationship? Okay,
that's a good point. I know as part of the exchanges China has with Central Asian countries in the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is about barter agreements. Right. Some of it is oil, some of it is natural gas. And there are still attempts at sort of internationalizing the RMB through barter. So that would in fact create a different path, a different trajectory for creating a reserve currency as compared to what we know from pound sterling and the dollar. It's, barter wasn't a big element in making pound sterling international reserve currency, and nor was it important in the US dollar trajectory. But beyond these sort of half-hearted symbolic attempts, I think Beijing is very, very careful and very wary of rushing headlong to replace the US dollar or to try and replace the US dollar. I think from Washington's perspective, this would be, I wouldn't say casus belli, but it would be a sign that we have a problem with a revisionist power. Right now, China, I guess, is considered semi-revisionist. Well, depends who you ask. I mean, the Pentagon, some people would tell you it's the number one problem. But I think the meme is that China is kind of semi-revisionist. By going, by jumping headlong and trying to make the RMB or trying to replace the US dollar, for example, by in its oil purchases from Saudi Arabia, I think that would be an indication China's gone one step further.
How about doing the same in the case of Iran, for example, where, of course, I don't think the Chinese would worry so much about that relationship being compromised with the Americans. So let's not use the example of Saudi Arabia. Let's use the example of Iran. Do you think that would be more feasible?
I think they're already doing it. To some extent, barter is already part of the economic relationship between Beijing and Tehran. But at the same time, we have to recall one very important thing about, and this is something we try to convey, I guess, Sanoshi in our book, and that is the fact that, despite the great hype about Sino-Iran relationship, there are also very profound conflicts of interest. One of the biggest areas where interest conflict is, of course, oil. China is interested in low prices of oil. Iran is interested in high prices of oil. Iran is interested in barter, presumably, and China is interested in hard currency. So, yes, there's here an element of this probably easier to do barter with Iran to sort of bypassing US dollar than in Saudi Arabia's case. But I think we have to be wary here of suggesting that Sino-Iranian relations are otherwise free of tension.
Right.
Niv, I find listening to your comments extremely informative, but I want to come at it from a bigger picture and angle as well, if I may. China sees itself at the moment with three soft spots and underbellies. One is on the technology in the case of Huawei and how they realized, oops, we don't have, the semiconductors and the chip capacity production, so we're dependent. The other one is energy, as Anush was just talking about, oil and gas and the dependency on the GCC at large, Iran being one of the elements in that puzzle. And the third one is the US dollar, right? So, and then openly, the Biden administration as well have come out and said, we want to stop China's track on continuing with its technological superiority. Isn't the China today finding itself, through their optics, oh my God, we would not have access to technology because, we're being cut off by our stalwart of our champion as a technological champion. Energy, we're interdependent to all the bases and, energy resource bases around the world that America has, and through the banking. So the China today may have a different calculus vis-a-vis US dollars. So what are your thoughts on that? Because, in 2008, even in financial crisis, they came out, not only in Asian financial crisis, even in 2008, the big financial crisis, they came out and pumped in, and they didn't get much of a slack and credit for it. And where does all of this fit into, Niv, and I stop after that, vis-a-vis the digital currencies and the fact that US is pushing all, various forms of coins, and China has come hard down and says, no, we're going to go with a state digital currency denominated. How would that play in this whole big picture?
Yes, I think I'll start with Bitcoin because it sort of underscores what we've discussed. If you really wonder why China has gone harder on Bitcoin as compared with the Europeans or the Americans, yes, it's this great phobia of monetary instability and fake currencies, overissuance of currency, all of those bugbears from the past. I think that plays a big role, and the Chinese leadership is risk averse. They're not prepared to take chances. And yet, having said that, China today already, let's not forget, it's a developing country, and yet it is the leader or one of the leaders in the world in the development of fintech, financial technologies and investment tools, and the usage of mobile phones for the Internet of Things, I think it's called, is really skyrocketing in China. So that's another dimension to the story that we have to remember. Generally speaking, you are right. I think Beijing is interested in better relations with Washington at the moment. I think they're still reeling from the effects of the Trump administration and the trade war. And one big sign for that is the fact that they've stopped using in public the word Made in China 2025, which is a huge agenda that's supposed to groom state-owned enterprises to become technological leaders on a global scale. And that's something that was very alarming in Washington's eyes. So they've really done stop making use of this term in public. So that's certainly an indication, for all of the exuberance about BRI or China's new role in the world or its leadership capacity, I think it still relies on Washington for the provision of
So Niv, let me take you exactly where you have now taken the discussion, and that is, which I agree with, that actually they're much rather free ride on America's hard power than having to invest their own. But they're still in a bit of a pickle in some ways strategically, because if the Americans pull out of the Middle East, they'll pull into East Asia, right? And the concern that I hear in Beijing is this pivot to Asia is an essentially anti-Chinese strategy. So if they want the security of flow of oil in particular, but also you and I know markets of the Middle East are now increasingly important to China. I mean, they're creating a whole new capital in Egypt, for example, and so on. Given the tensions in relations among states in West Asia and the Middle East, which is a hard place for China to keep the security of the region dependent on the United States and keep it pinned there, or slowly but surely see the pressure of the US lifted for China to move in a much bigger way that countries like Iran, like Pakistan, and dare I say even Egypt and others would like to see?
Yes, it's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think China...
It's worth more than that, actually, Niv.
Yes, much more. It's pittance. In Gulf terms, it's pittance, that's for sure. Look, Anusha, I think you may have a different view on this, but I think China is just unprepared to step into America's shoes in the Middle East. It's just, yes, the Americans have withdrawn from Afghanistan. Yes, there is vacuum. But if anyone is expecting tomorrow to have plane loads of Chinese soldiers on the ground, in Kabul, I think they're mistaken. The Chinese their plan is long term. They're not banking on American collapse. They think America is in decline. Yes, they do genuinely believe America is in decline. But they also know the Americans have long breath, and that in their view, this is going to take decades. It's a game of decades. It's not a game of days or years. So no, I don't see the Fifth Fleet being replaced by China's 1.5 aircraft carrier. Or yes, they have 1 million soldiers, but they haven't fought a war since '79. So this is, I think we're daydreaming if we bank on Chinese security assurances. Having said that, the Chinese do want America out of Asia, and they, perhaps more than anything else, want to reunite with what they call with Taiwan. And so this is certainly a stumbling block, because there are certain things beyond economics. As human beings, as nations, we have sometimes things that we strive for, or that are part of our belief system, our value system, where we can't place, it cannot be replaced by money or by deals. Or Taiwan is one of those issues for the Chinese, and so here I'm a little bit concerned. I think the rhetoric coming out of Beijing in recent months suggests, that we may have here, if not a showdown, then a problem in the next decade or so.
Niv, I just want to weave into what Anush was picking on, and very few people have studied as well and as thoroughly as you have done the work of Zheng Bijian and Wang Honing, if I'm pronouncing their names properly. And these are two, scholars that you know very well. And there's a lot, isn't there a little bit of an overboil at the moment in terms of China's ambitions going back to these, thought leaders? Because China at the moment has one base, military base in Djibouti, if I'm not making a mistake. Even if they open 5 bases per year, they need 150 years to catch up with US bases around the world. And, so isn't there a thread between that philosophy of these two thought leaders and China's rise? And can you shed some light on that and unpack it for us?
Yes, touched on two very interesting individuals. When I studied Wang Honing, I never expected, to be honest, I never expected him to rise up so quickly. It was a hunch. And here he is in the Politburo Standing Committee. So there's some say it's Xi Jinping's brains. That's an exaggeration, but it does play a huge role, particularly in articulating China's soft power. Wang Honing is an example of a US skeptic. Someone who visited America. It's kind of interesting, many of us visited the US, had experiences, some might not have been very positive, but overwhelmingly, I think, when you go there, you are sort of overwhelmed by the level of efficiency, technology. And Wang Honing was skeptical all along. He said, there's something not quite right about this society. And Mao Zedong said similar things, but Wang Honing was much more articulate, and he was able to sort of specify. He had a fellowship from memory in one of the top universities in the US, so he could also peek at the shenanigans of academic life. The sort of thing that interests us: who gets fellowship, who gets research funding, who goes overseas, who gets promoted. And he said, "Look, it's all rigged." That was his conclusion. It's all rigged. Now, it's interesting. This. How much of it is genuine, how much of it is propaganda in real life experience, I don't know. No one can tell for sure. But these are sobering memoirs that he had, sobering memoirs that kind of tell us, look, we may like the US, we may look up to the US. Broadly in the West, we look up to the US, but look, the Chinese, not all Chinese, but some Chinese, even some Chinese who studied in America come away with different impressions because of the baggage they had. So that's I think is important to recall. We're different as human beings, and to expect that 2-year BA studies, for example, of Chinese students in the West would turn them into diehard liberals is I think off the mark. It's just off the mark. It doesn't work like that in real life. And so Zhang Bijian is an opposite character, if you like. He was one of the architects of the rapprochement between Washington and Beijing, and he was quite positive. He may have had some negative thoughts about the US, but we don't have many of those on the public record. And it's striking because what Zhang Bijian tried to do is to sort of invoke, envision amity between Beijing and Washington, directed at what he called the Soviet Bay. Right. So it's a different era, it's a Cold War that the Chinese often accuse many of us in the West of Cold War mentality. Zhang Bijian had a Cold War mentality of his own. But it worked to the benefit of Sino-American relations. So two very interesting individuals. The bottom line is one is now in the Politburo Standing Committee, the other is retired. This also carries weight.
It's fascinating, the question that Ali asked you about personalities that you so articulately explained it. When one hears from US opinion makers in particular that so-and-so minister in Iran was educated in the United States, you're right not to draw the simplistic conclusion from that actually just because they're educated there doesn't mean that they're advocates of that model, of that culture, out of that state. And as you rightly say, people travel for different reasons and they go back to their origins for similarly different reasons. And it doesn't mean that if you like, their ideological, political, cultural allegiances somehow change because of that experience as a educationalist, if you like, in the United States. So that is fascinating response. Niv, I'm an avid reader and admirer of the Washington Quarterly journal, which comes out of DC. The latest issue, the autumn issue, has an interesting article that talks about, be careful about the rise of China and the Russian-Chinese alliance and the decline in America. But the author also relates this to a knowledge of history. I'm not saying I'm saying a knowledge of history. Given that you're a very distinguished historian, would you agree that actually you can learn very wrong lessons from history and equating Soviet-Chinese relations of the 1960s and 70s with the current parameters of a new Cold War would be a very dangerous precedent on which to build policy?
This is a critical question, Anush. I think the focus here has been around the rise of Germany just before World War I, the rise of Germany and how the British reacted, and whether or not the balance of power at that time. China, of course, was much weaker at the time. It wasn't part of the story. But the question is whether China's rise today, does not in some way mimic or follow in the footsteps of Germany's rise to power. Now, there's a few arguments made here about, particularly about economic integration, because a lot of the times we hear, look, how can the US go to war with China when there's so much trade between them? Well, the fact of the matter is that before World War I, Germany, Britain was Germany's #1 export market. There was, and Britain, Great Britain exported a lot of services, banking and otherwise, to Germany. Germany was reliant on London finance to some extent. So to infer from all of this that somehow trade is our security policy, I think is wrong. Having said that, to conclude that we have a one-to-one overlap between the World War I and what is now unfolding in South China Sea is exaggerated. We have to be very careful of applying the World War I scenario to China nowadays, because yes, the Chinese can be assertive, sometimes they can be aggressive, but if you look at the track record of the last 15 years, Anush, apart from India, they've resolved all of their border conflicts, and we're talking about millions of square kilometers here. These are not just scraps of grass here and there. This is, and for them, it was difficult because the historical consciousness is all about losing territory. They're still very disgruntled about losing Mongolia, for example. And yet here they are negotiating in the Hu Jintao era. They've been able to resolve all of the border conflicts. They haven't gone to war again with India, thankfully, since the last time around. South China Sea is somehow managed, although it can boil over. So, yes, we can draw the wrong conclusions. If we get too fussed about World War I think, in particular, which is the narrative that now captures the headlines, and try to sort of see Germany as China, then we may reach the wrong conclusions.
I just want to jump in and make one comment and raise a question or two, and then bring it to a conclusion. Why? Because sitting with a historian is just, too tempting to continue, and we're mindful of your precious time, Niv, and this should continue on another session. But one remark, perhaps. I'm always baffled by the think tanks in the Western Hemisphere, who are many of them in DC or at other places, are enamored by, a sort of a change and transformative change like Soviet style in China. And I'm sharing this with a historian and with a fellow academic and a dear colleague, Anush, on this platform. I always find it a bit myopic, to say the least, because if 5% of Chinese after a Soviet-style velvet revolution in any color don't want to live in China, that's 75 million Chinese. They're not going to settle in India or in Pakistan or in Middle East. They're going to march to Europe and United States. So where do these think tanks get these ideas about, transformation and breakup of China without acknowledging these realities? That's my first question. This last one is, what is your message as a historian to xenophobes and xenophiles? If you were to leave them with one message, what would that be?
Sure. Look, the think tankery, is we have all sorts. That's perhaps part of our strength in the West. That we have, unlike China, where think tanks are overwhelmingly government-sponsored, government-regulated. There's different voices in the think tankery, the sort of think tankery that we have. But you're right that, by and large, at least until a decade ago, there was, or at least until Xi Jinping came to power, there was an expectation that China would liberalize or that the regime would come tumbling down. In many quarters, there was this expectation. It hasn't happened. This was also the rationale behind American policy vis-a-vis Beijing. That if we engage with them and if we let trade flourish, and if we let students study on both ends and allow people-to-people contact, and maybe set up democracy endowments in Hong Kong, that eventually, there will be a sea change, and that hasn't happened. So yes, this was perhaps misguided. But let us not forget that when the Soviet Union collapsed, most experts were caught unprepared. So things can happen sometimes overnight. And even now, as we speak, we have the strongest leader in China since Mao Zedong holding the reins. But on the sidelines, there are pressures, and there's also politicking to try and get rid of him. So one never knows. We have to be careful of crystal balling, as it were. So that's the think tank question. I think the other question I think, remind me.
I said, what is your message as a historian to xenophobes and xenophiles, both of them, if you were to leave each group with one key message?
It's a fitting question to close, and to both xenophiles and xenophobes, my response would be engage, 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 engage. I think that's the only way to sort of understand the world is by reading, meeting people, talking to people right around the planet, and trying to understand their point of view. It may not lead you to be sympathetic, but it will certainly leave you with a bit more knowledge.
Absolutely brilliant. Very sage advice, if I may say so, Niv, for those who make decisions, but also for those who have to follow decisions, to be slightly more aware of the notion of the other, as it were. Your discussion with us has been absolutely brilliant. It's intimidating because when we ask you to pull water out of the well, we know that you've got the long rope and you can dig really deep, as you have demonstrated here for us today. So it's been an absolute pleasure to have you as our guest, Niv, and we look forward to engaging with you again and continuing to read your scholarship and your commentaries that you disseminate so ably as well. So very much appreciate you engaging with us today, Niv.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Niv.